There are people who move through this world quietly, yet leave an echo that lingers long after they are gone. Not because they try to be seen, but because something within them cannot be ignored. You may have been told you are different, too sensitive, or hard to understand, as if these words were flaws rather than signs of depth. But what if they are not flaws at all? What if they are quiet indicators of a rare kind of personality, one that feels more deeply, sees more clearly, and carries a strength that does not shout but endures? In a world that often rewards imitation, there are still a few who were never meant to blend in. They were meant to observe, to question, to rise in silence, and to stand in truth even when it stands alone. There is a kind of soul that does not fear being alone, because in solitude it does not feel empty, it feels whole. While the world rushes to fill every silence with noise, distraction, and constant company, you have learned to sit with yourself without running away, not because you have given up on people, but because you have discovered something many never do. Your own presence is enough. In that quiet space, you are not abandoned. You are restored. Others may mistake your silence for distance, as if you are pulling away from life itself. But what they do not see is that your silence is not absence, it is awareness. It is where you listen to your own thoughts without interference, where you feel your own truth before it is shaped by the opinions of others. In that stillness, you are not less alive. You are more awake than ever. You have come to understand that loneliness is not the same as being alone. Loneliness is a feeling of being disconnected, even in a crowd, while solitude is a chosen return to yourself. And you, whether by choice or by experience, have learned the difference. You do not fill every moment with people just to avoid yourself. Instead, you have learned to sit with your thoughts, even the uncomfortable ones, until they reveal their meaning. There is a quiet strength in this that few will ever recognize. The world often celebrates those who speak the loudest, yet overlooks those whose silence carries depth. But your silence is not empty. It is layered with reflection, with understanding, with things that cannot be rushed into words. And when you finally do speak, it is not to impress. It is to express something that has already been fully understood within you. Over time, you may have noticed that not everyone understands this part of you. Some may even try to pull you out of your quiet, as if your stillness is something that needs fixing. But what they do not realize is that you are not hiding. You are healing, observing, becoming. You are learning to trust your own company in a world that often teaches dependence on noise. And so you continue walking with this rare comfort in solitude, not as someone disconnected from life, but as someone deeply connected to it in a way that does not always need to be seen or explained. Because in your silence, there is a voice, and in your solitude, there is a strength that does not ask for permission to exist. You feel deeply in a world that often rewards feeling nothing at all, and in that depth, there is both your greatest burden and your most extraordinary gift. While many learn to filter their emotions, to soften their reactions, to keep life at a manageable distance, you experience things as they are, unfiltered, unhidden, and sometimes overwhelming in their honesty. You do not simply pass through moments, you absorb them. Joy does not just touch you, it stays with you. Pain does not just visit, it teaches you, reshapes you, and lingers in places others never notice. There are times when this depth feels like too much, as if the world was not designed for someone who notices everything. You feel the weight of words that were never said, the meaning behind gestures others dismiss, the sadness hidden behind smiles people wear too easily. And because of this, you may have learned that not everyone knows what to do with someone who feels so completely. Some call it intensity, others call it sensitivity, but neither word fully captures the truth of it. It is not weakness, it is awareness at its highest form. In a world that often teaches emotional distance as protection, you remain exposed in ways that cannot be easily disguised. You care when others choose indifference. You remember when others forget. You are affected when others move on without looking back. And though this can make you feel out of place, it also means you are never numb to life. You are fully present in it, even when presence hurts. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes with feeling this much, especially when the world does not always return the same depth. You may have learned to hide parts of yourself, to soften your reactions, to pretend that things do not move you as deeply as they do. But even when you try, your inner world does not stop speaking. It continues to notice, to question, to feel beneath the surface of things. Yet within this intensity lies something rare and unshakable. Because when you love with sincerity that cannot be rehearsed. When you understand someone, it is not surface level. It reaches into the parts of them they rarely show. And when you care, it is not temporary. It becomes something that stays with you, even in silence, even in absence. Over time, you begin to realize that feeling deeply is not something to escape from, but something to understand. It is not a flaw to be corrected, but a language that not everyone can speak. And while the world may not always know how to hold your depth, that does not make it less real. It simply means you were never meant to experience life lightly. You were meant to experience it fully. There comes a moment in your life when you begin to recognize that not every environment you are placed in is meant to be your home. Not every circle, not every conversation, not every expectation deserves your participation. And yet, many people remain, not because it is right, but because it is familiar. You are different in that way. Something within you refuses to call chaos normal, even when everyone around you has agreed to live inside it. You have likely felt it before. That quiet discomfort when everything outside looks acceptable, yet something inside you feels unsettled. It may not always be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is just a subtle awareness that you are shrinking in places you are expected to grow, or that you are losing clarity in environments that demand confusion. And in those moments, while others adjust themselves to fit in, you begin to question whether you belong there at all. Walking away for you is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of preservation. It is not about proving a point to others, but about refusing to betray something within yourself that recognizes when peace is being replaced by noise and when stability is being disguised as compromise. There is a quiet courage in that decision because it often means you are stepping away from what others still accept without question. People may not always understand your distance. Some may call it sensitivity, others may call it avoidance. But what they do not see is the clarity it takes to leave a place where your spirit feels compromised. It is not easy to detach from what is familiar, even when it is harmful. Familiarity has a way of convincing people to stay, even when staying slowly diminishes them. But you have learned, sometimes through experience and sometimes through pain, that familiarity is not always truth. There is something deeply internal that guides you in these moments. It is not always logical in the way others expect decisions to be. It is more intuitive, more felt than explained. You begin to sense when a space is no longer aligned with who you are becoming. And once you see it clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee it. You may stay longer than you should, but eventually, something within you chooses clarity over comfort. Walking away does not make you distant from life. It makes you more honest with it, because you are no longer willing to confuse chaos for connection or tension for belonging. You begin to understand that peace is not something you find after enduring disorder for too long. It is something you protect by not staying where disorder is normalized. And so you move differently, quietly perhaps, without spectacle or explanation, but with intention, because you are not running away from life. You are walking toward a version of it where your presence does not require you to abandon yourself. There is a kind of knowing that does not come from books, classrooms, or instructions handed down by others. It arrives slowly, often quietly, shaped by moments that were not easy to live through but impossible to forget. You may not always be able to explain how you know what you know, but it sits within you with a certainty that does not depend on validation. It is the kind of inner wisdom that grows in silence, often in the aftermath of confusion, disappointment, or loss. Life, in its unpredictable way, has a method of teaching without announcing that it is teaching. It does not pause to make lessons comfortable or clear. Instead, it places you in situations where you are forced to see more than what is spoken, to understand more than what is shown, and to feel more than what is intended. And in those moments, something within you begins to observe differently. You start to notice patterns, intentions, and truths that are not written on the surface of things. This wisdom does not arrive all at once. It builds itself through experiences that challenge what you once believed to be certain. A disappointment becomes understanding. A betrayal becomes awareness. A silence that once felt empty becomes meaningful. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to carry a deeper perception of life, one that cannot be easily explained to those who have not lived through the same weight of realization. There are times when this kind of inner knowing feels isolating, because you may see things unfolding before they fully reveal themselves, or you may sense truths that others are not yet ready to acknowledge. And in those moments, you learn restraint. You learn that not every realization needs to be spoken aloud, and not every truth will be received with understanding. So you carry it quietly, not as a burden, but as a responsibility to your own clarity. What makes this wisdom rare is not just that it exists, but that it is earned. It is not inherited through instruction alone, but remembered through experience that leaves a lasting imprint. You do not simply absorb knowledge, you live through it until it becomes part of how you see everything. And because of that, your understanding of people, of choices, of consequences, carries a depth that cannot be easily replicated. Over time, you may notice that you rely less on external validation to confirm what you already sense within yourself. There is a growing trust in your own perception, even when it stands apart from the opinions around you. This is not arrogance, it is recognition of how far you have come in learning to listen to something deeper than noise, something steadier than doubt. And so this inner wisdom remains with you, shaped not by ease but by experience, not by instruction but by living. And though it was never formally given to you, it has become one of the most defining parts of who you are. There is a quiet kind of presence that does not announce itself, does not compete for space, and does not ask to be noticed, yet somehow it is never overlooked. You may have experienced this in moments when you were simply being yourself, not performing, not trying to impress, not shaping yourself for approval, and still found that people remembered you, not because you demanded attention, but because something about your energy remained even after you had left the room. You do not move through life with the urgency of being seen. There is no need within you to constantly prove your worth through visibility. While others may measure their significance by how loudly they are heard or how often they are acknowledged, you have a different rhythm. You are not absent from the world. You are simply not dependent on its applause. And that difference changes the way you exist in any space you enter. What makes your presence noticeable is not volume, but depth. There is a certain steadiness in the way you carry yourself, a quiet authenticity that does not shift depending on who is watching. People may not always understand it in the moment, but they feel it. They sense that you are not pretending to be someone else just to be accepted. And in a world where so much is shaped by performance, that kind of realness becomes unforgettable. You may not always be the loudest voice in the room, but you are often the one people think about afterward, not because you interrupted the moment, but because you added something to it that could not be easily replaced. Sometimes it is a look that carried understanding, sometimes a silence that felt more honest than words, sometimes a presence that made everything else feel slightly more grounded. There is a subtle power in not chasing attention, because when attention is no longer your goal, your energy is no longer scattered. You are not constantly adjusting yourself to be more visible or more acceptable. Instead, you begin to exist in a way that is aligned with who you are rather than how you are perceived. And ironically, that alignment often makes you more memorable than any attempt to be noticed ever could. Still, this way of being is not always understood. There are times when people misinterpret your quietness as distance or your restraint as disinterest. But what they do not always see is that you are not withdrawing. You are simply not performing. You are present, but not exaggerated. Open, but not exposed beyond what is real. And that balance, though subtle, is rare. Over time, you come to realize that presence does not require noise. It does not require constant validation or external confirmation. It exists in how truthfully you occupy your own life. And even when you are not trying to be seen, you remain someone who is felt, remembered, and quietly recognized long after the moment has passed. There is a moment in every life when holding on begins to feel heavier than letting go. Not because the hurt has disappeared, and not because the memory has faded, but because something within you begins to understand that carrying pain does not change what happened. It only changes the one who carries it. And so forgiveness starts to form quietly, not as an announcement, not as a performance, but as a private decision made deep within your spirit. You may have been shaped by moments where others crossed boundaries, where trust was misplaced, or where words left marks that were never visible to the world but deeply felt within you. And in those moments, it would have been easier to hold on, to replay, to justify the anger, to let resentment become a place of residence. But something in you resists that kind of confinement. Something in you refuses to let yesterday decide the quality of your tomorrow. Forgiveness, for you, is not a declaration that what happened was acceptable. It is not an agreement with injustice, nor a dismissal of pain. It is something quieter and more personal. It is the recognition that if you remain bound to what hurt you, you are still living inside its shadow, and there comes a point where you begin to choose light over repetition, peace over recall, even if the memory still exists. There is strength in that choice that is often misunderstood. People may think forgiveness means weakness or that it means forgetting too easily, but what they do not see is the internal work it requires, the quiet confrontation with your own emotions, the honest acknowledgement of what you lost, and the decision to no longer let that loss define the direction of your life. You learn, slowly, that forgiveness is not always a single moment. Sometimes it is a process that unfolds over time, returning again and again until the weight becomes lighter. Some days you may still feel the sting of what happened. Some days you may still remember it with clarity. But even then, you no longer allow it to build a home inside your spirit. What makes this kind of forgiveness rare is that it is not dependent on the actions of others. It does not wait for apology to begin, nor does it require permission to continue. It is an internal release, a decision to stop allowing the past to negotiate with your present. And in that release, something within you becomes unchained, not because the other person changed, but because you did. There is a quiet dignity in no longer carrying what was never meant to stay. Not because it did not matter, but because you begin to understand that your life cannot move forward while constantly looking backward. And so you loosen your grip, not out of forgetfulness, but out of self-respect. And in that space, you create by letting go. You do not become empty. You become available again to peace, to clarity, to the parts of yourself that were waiting patiently beyond the weight of memory. There is a kind of mind that does not settle easily into answers handed down by others. It listens, it observes, it considers, but it does not simply accept. Even when something is repeated with confidence, even when it is widely agreed upon, there is a part of you that pauses and asks, but is it true or is it just familiar? This is not defiance for its own sake. It is something quieter, more inward, a need to understand life beyond surface agreement. You may have noticed that many people find comfort in certainty. They prefer conclusions that are already formed, beliefs that require no further examination, and ideas that allow them to move through life without questioning too deeply. But you are not built in that same way. For you, comfort does not come from certainty alone, it comes from clarity. And clarity, for you, must be earned, not borrowed. This is why you question. Not because you reject everything, but because you refuse to let anything settle inside you without first passing through awareness. You examine words that are spoken with authority. You look again at traditions, assumptions, and expectations that others may follow without hesitation. And in doing so, you are not trying to break the world. You are trying to understand whether it is built on truth or repetition. There are moments when this way of thinking makes you feel separate. It is not always easy to be the one who does not immediately agree, who does not quickly conform, who does not find satisfaction in easy answers. Sometimes silence follows your questions, sometimes misunderstanding, and sometimes you are left standing in a space where certainty would have been easier, but honesty feels more important. Yet even with that weight, you continue, because something within you does not allow blind acceptance to feel like peace. You would rather sit with uncertainty than pretend to understand what you do not. You would rather admit, I do not know yet, than hold on to something that feels incomplete. And in that honesty, there is a kind of integrity that cannot be taught. It is lived. Over time, you begin to see that questioning is not destruction. It is refinement. It is how false layers fall away, how inherited beliefs are tested, how truth becomes something you have touched yourself rather than something you were told to repeat. And although this process can be uncomfortable, it also shapes a mind that is difficult to mislead and a spirit that is difficult to control. Not everyone will understand this part of you. Some may prefer agreement over depth, simplicity over inquiry. But your path is different. You are not here to echo what already exists without reflection. You are here to look again, to think again, to feel again, until what remains is something that feels real to you, not just accepted by others. And in that quiet persistence of questioning, you do not become lost. You become more awake to the difference between what is said and what is true. There is a moment in your journey where love stops being something you chase blindly and begins to become something you understand with clearer eyes. Not because your capacity to love has weakened, but because life has taught you that not every form of love is meant to hold you gently. Some attachments arrive wearing warmth on the surface, yet slowly begin to take more than they give, until you are left wondering where you ended and the relationship began. You have likely experienced love in its many forms, some that nurtured you and some that asked you to shrink in order to be kept. And over time, something within you started to notice the difference. Not immediately, not loudly, but in quiet realizations that accumulated within your awareness. You began to see that affection alone is not always enough if it comes with conditions that require you to abandon parts of yourself. There is a depth in you that makes you capable of loving fully without hesitation or half measures. When you care, you do not do so superficially. You invest yourself sincerely, often hoping that sincerity will be met with the same level of honesty. But life has a way of teaching that not all connections are built on equal understanding. And so, through experience, you begin to recognize when love is expanding you and when it is quietly diminishing you. This realization does not make you less open. It makes you more aware. You still feel deeply, still care genuinely, still hold space for connection, but you no longer confuse intensity with health. You begin to understand that just because something is strong does not mean it is safe for your inner world. And just because something is familiar does not mean it is right for your growth. There is a kind of strength that emerges when you stop negotiating your worth inside relationships, when you no longer stay in places where you must constantly prove your value, explain your boundaries, or justify your emotional existence. It is not about building walls. It is about recognizing where your energy is respected and where it is slowly being eroded. You may have once believed that love required endurance at any cost, that staying longer meant being more loyal, and giving more meant being more deserving. But life gradually reshapes that belief. You begin to understand that love, in its truest form, does not ask you to disappear. It does not require you to become smaller, quieter, or less of who you are in order to remain accepted. And so your love begins to change, not in its depth, but in its direction. It becomes more discerning, more conscious, more aligned with self-respect. You still love, but you no longer confuse sacrifice with surrender. You no longer mistake emotional depletion for emotional devotion. In this understanding, you do not become closed off. You become selective with your presence, careful with your openness, and honest with your limits. Because you have learned that the most meaningful love is not the one that consumes you, but the one that allows you to remain fully yourself while it exists beside you. There is a quiet realization that comes to you over time, not as a sudden revelation, but as something that slowly settles into your understanding of yourself. You begin to see that your path was never meant to mirror the paths of others, not because you are better, and not because you are apart by choice alone, but because something within you does not fully belong to imitation. There is a difference in the way you think, feel, and perceive the world that does not easily align with the comfort of blending in. For a long time, you may have tried to adjust yourself to fit into spaces that did not quite hold you. You learned the language of belonging, the gestures of acceptance, the silence that is often required to avoid standing out too sharply. And yet, even in those moments of adjustment, there was always something within you that remained unchanged. A quiet voice that reminded you that fitting in is not the same as being true to yourself. There is a weight that comes with being different, especially in environments where sameness is rewarded and individuality is softened. You may have felt it in the subtle ways people respond to you, in the pauses that follow your thoughts, in the moments where your presence feels slightly too reflective for the pace of the world around you. And in those spaces, it becomes easier to question yourself than to question the environment. But over time, something shifts. You begin to understand that standing out is not always about visibility or recognition. Sometimes it is simply about refusing to abandon your inner truth just to match external expectations. It is about allowing your thoughts to remain your own, even when they do not echo what is commonly accepted. It is about trusting that your perspective has value, even when it does not immediately find agreement. There is a certain solitude that comes with this understanding, not a loneliness rooted in absence, but a solitude rooted in clarity. You start to see that not everyone is meant to walk the same rhythm, and not every connection requires complete similarity. Some paths are quieter, more reflective, less crowded, and yet they are no less meaningful. Standing out does not always feel powerful in the moment. Sometimes it feels like distance, sometimes it feels like being misunderstood, and sometimes it feels like being placed slightly outside the center of things. But even in that space, there is a kind of grounding that begins to form. You learn to rely less on external validation and more on internal alignment. You begin to trust your own direction, even when it is not widely followed. And so, slowly, you stop measuring your worth by how closely you resemble others. You begin to recognize that your uniqueness is not a flaw to correct, but a truth to carry. Even if it means walking alone at times, even if it means being less understood than you once hoped, there is a deeper peace in no longer denying what you are.